and we will think about tissues. And again, a good start point is to think about the definition of a tissue. And this can be summed up as a group of cells of the same or similar type that work together to perform a particular function. Now, if I were to have said to you, take 5 minutes, think about everything we've said about cells, and now see if you can muddle through and come up with your own definition of tissues, you would probably have got that far or got something similar to that. The bit that people always forget, though, is this little bit on the end, and that is, and their associated tissue fluids. The basis of all tissue fluids is water, but within that water we have a whole host of different dissolved substances, and the chemistries of the fluids and the compositions of the fluids will vary depending on which tissue we're in. And obviously the composition is also specific to the type of cells that are forming that tissue. So we need to think about the cells and their fluids as well. Now we can use different categories or different classifications for tissues. I think the simplest way to think about tissues is to divide them into two major types. Firstly, simple tissues. Where there is only one cell type making up the particular tissue. Or compound tissues, where there is more than one type. For example, blood is a compound tissue. We have different sorts of blood cells within the bloodstream. Now, if we take the human body, within it, we have 4 main types of tissue. And they are epithelial tissues, connective tissues, muscle tissues, and nervous tissues. And today we're going to talk about epithelial tissues and connective tissues. They're very important, very interesting, and we don't really get space anywhere else in the syllabus to target them, so we'll get through those today. The muscle tissues and the form of muscle tissue and the structure of muscle tissue we will talk about when we do the musculoskeletal system, so that will be next week. And nervous tissues we will cover in detail when we look at the nervous system. So today we're going to concentrate on these two. So we'll consider epithelial tissues first. Now, all epithelial tissues are lining tissues. So we find epithelial tissue lining various structures of the body. It may be the inner cavities of organs, or lining tubular structures, or surrounding open cavities like your mouth. Okay, so they line parts of the body in some way. And with the epithelial tissues, all the cells are attached to what we term the basement membrane. And the basement membrane is basically made out of collagen. Has anybody heard of collagen before? Yeah? Not to do with collagen implants? What type of chemical is collagen? It's a protein, yes. It's a type of fibrous structural protein. And the basement membrane literally forms the foundation of the epithelial tissue that the cells then sit upon. And it helps just to keep everything together. So it's basically all collagen, and we see it of varying thicknesses dependent on which sort of tissue we're talking about. Now, epithelial tissue itself, we can also divide into 3 types. There are simple epithelial tissues, stratified, and transitional. And we will look at examples of each in turn and look at the structure of the cells and where we find them, the sorts of functions that they get up to. And with regard to simple epithelial tissues, we again have 3 different sorts. The first of these that we can consider is columnar epithelium. What shape do you think the cells are? Like columns. Easy, isn't it? Okay. They're rectangular and sit short end onto the basement membrane. So we have these tall rectangular cells stacked up next to each other. That sit with the short end down on the basement membrane. Another feature of this type of cell is that the nucleus generally sits very low down in the cell, not too far above the basement membrane. And if you look at pictures of columnar epithelium, you can see all these dots all lined up towards the bottom. Now that's the very basic bog standard columnar epithelial tissue, but it can show specializations and adaptations to suit the particular region in which it's found. So if we think of some of the specializations of the columnar epithelial tissue, some cells within the range of columnar epithelial tissue may form goblet cells. Now, does anybody know what goblet cells do? Yeah, well done. Okay. Goblet cells secrete mucus. Let me just tidy this diagram up a second and I'll show you what the goblet cells are like. So we would have the basement membrane, columnar epithelial cells, and then every now and again we'd see one of these goblet cells. And they have this large vacuole inside them. A vacuole is just a membrane surrounded space, and it's full of mucus. And what they are capable of doing is manufacturing mucus, filling up this vacuole and then disgorging the vacuole so that the mucus spews out over the surface of the membrane. Another adaptation, another specialization, is that they may have a microvillus brush border. And you remember the microvillus brush border from earlier. That's where the membrane is drawn out into a whole series of little tiny projections, such as we have here. Now, we find columnar epithelium in lots of different parts of the body. For example, we find it lining the trachea. And in the trachea, we also find the specializations of goblet cells and the microvillus brush border. Okay, the windpipe is the trachea.
Does it have normal ones or only has the two specializations?
It would have normal ones as well along certain regions. And as I'm sure you're aware, well, you certainly will be when we do the respiratory system, the columnar epithelium lining the trachea forms a protective lining. When we breathe in, if you take a good lungful of air, you also breathe in all sorts of tiny microscopic debris. It's not just gases that go into your system. So there will be fungal spores, bacteria, microscopic bits of dust. And if all those things got into your lungs, then they would irritate the lungs and possibly predispose to a cough or infection or something like that. And what happens is that as we breathe in, a lot of that material is filtered out, first of all in the nasal cavity, but also in the trachea. So the trachea is a long, straight tube, and then it splits into two at the end, and it's lined with the columnar epithelium and the goblet cells producing mucus. And as you breathe in and take in all your air, and you also take in the debris, the little particles of things, they get attracted to the mucus. And it all gets stuck within the mucus and is prevented from coming deeper into the lungs. The microvillus brush border then carries the mucus with the debris stuck in it up towards your throat, away from the lung tissue. It comes up towards your throat, and then you clear your throat and invariably swallow it. Okay, so you digest all those bits of rubbish. Okay. It's this lining that gets eroded and destroyed in smokers. What happens then, of course, when you smoke is that you take in such huge amounts of particulate matter that this epithelial tissue gets overloaded, it gets swamped with all the debris. And the cells themselves may die, or all of the microvillus brush borders get worn away. So although the mucus may be catching the debris, it can't then get moved. And when you lie down at night, all of this sits as almost like a sludge in the trachea. You get up in the morning, and of course you go from this prone position to being upright, and gravity helps all of this mucus full of debris and rubbish drop down towards your lungs. And then you have to cough heavily, use muscular contraction and so on to try and help bring it up from further on down. And that's your smoker's cough. If you stop smoking, it does all grow back. Yes. It will repair. Takes time, but it will repair. There's hope for you yet.